Joining me for the big story this morning is Dr. Carlos Lopez. Dr. Carlos is the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
Doctor, first off, the deadline for the 8 Millennium Development Goals is drawing nigh. That's 31st December 2015. And truth be told is that many countries will not have achieved most of these 8 Millennium Development Goals. But focus seems now to be shifting to something else, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. One would think, are we not biting off a lot more than we can chew? Why not focus first on the 8 MDGs, be sure that we can get them out of the way, and then we can get to something else like the Sustainable Development Goals?
Well, first of all, we have to clarify that when the MDGs were established, the Millennium Development Goals, the objective was to halve poverty by half and attain a number of other objectives, and all of those have been attained at the universal level. So the world as such has made incredible progress, and some of the goals have actually been surpassed. So the record is impeccable. What people normally say is that for certain countries, they have not attained all the 8 goals. Because when you decompose the universal line into a national line, it is true that a number of countries have not attained some of the goals. But even that is also subject to some review, because what you have is a situation where if you are saying a country like Uruguay has to reduce poverty from 8 to 4%, halving the poverty, is the same as Burkina from 80 to 40%, this is quite unfair, because it's like asking a marathonist to run with a sprinter, because some have just a very small stretch to make the goal and the target, whereas others are way behind. And this is probably the case for most African countries. So Africans have been set not to achieve all the goals because of the way we have measured this. But I think the progress in terms of effort has been quite outstanding, including in the African countries. When you measure in terms of effort, out of the 20 best performers, 15 are African. Now, we are discussing Sustainable Development Goals, which is no longer just about developing countries. It's about everybody. Because now there is a dimension of environment that makes it universal agenda. Because countries actually in the north, countries that are rich, have more to adjust and to adapt than other countries in terms of environment. Their record is poor, their performance has been very bad in terms of emissions, pollution. So they have a lot to do on the environmental front in comparison with the other countries. So the Sustainable Development Goals, this new emerging agenda, is a universal one. It concerns everybody.
Doctor, there is no paucity when it comes to planning. I think we do a good job when it comes to putting pen to paper. You know, be it in our case, Vision 2040, the National Planning Authority does an incredible job. The 8 Millennium Development Goals are good put on paper, and when it comes to implementation, I think that is where there is a challenge. We hardly do that. So thought would be, aren't the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, going to suffer the same fate? They look good on paper. Implementation.
Well, you know, there was a time in the 80s and 90s where planning was abandoned completely, and we were basically on the short-term policy prospect, which is not good either. And I think now that the level of ambition has grown, we can say that safely, you know, implementation is going to be a challenge, as you have put it rightly. But let's not be so pessimistic as to think that we have to throw the baby with the bathwater, because what is happening is actually a situation where African countries have sustained 5% growth for about a decade and a half. In terms of GDP, their GDP has doubled during that period. There is only one region, historically speaking, that has doubled its GDP, its economic wealth, in less time. That is China. So the record is not that bad. We tend to be a bit pessimistic about African record because our level of ambition is very high, and because we know this growth has no quality. It's a growth that is not creating jobs enough. It's a growth that is not inclusive enough. It's a growth that doesn't have enough social protection. So the frustration is there, and it's justified. But let's not just be over pessimistic.
Doctor, since the 1960s, Africa has received aid to the tune of about $1 trillion directly and indirectly from the West, from agencies like the UN, where you come from. Truth be told, this aid has not ameliorated Africa. It has not made it better, and there's everything to show for that. Do you subscribe to the school of thought that is aid maybe is something that is antiquated, something that should be of the past? We need to move forward. When does this discussion begin?
I think, the centrality of aid is really over. If we think that countries develop because of aid, we are completely out of touch with reality. Countries develop when they have the stamina, the strategy, and the resources domestically to develop. No country has developed with aid. Aid can be a palliative. It can help, the suffering of some people. It can be important for humanitarian reasons. It can be important to build institutions. It can be important to support capacity. But it's not a replacement for internal agency. Countries only develop when they have ownership of their processes and they are actually going to do it with their own strength. And I think Africa may have received $1 trillion of aid, but Africa has also lost more than $1 trillion of bad contracts, of illicit financial flows, and all that comes with it. So we don't really estimate enough what has been outflowing from the continent in illicit ways that is probably much higher than the aid that the continent has received.
That would mean, and you've had proponents say that, look, what Africa actually needs is not aid, but an equal share of international trade, fairness out there. Is this a discussion that the UN would be willing to foster? Because you see, if we have fair international trade, then this aid is not necessary for us. If we can be able to sell our commodities fairly, etc., that should make things happen.
You are talking about a very important subject, and trade actually is the norm-setting responsibility of World Trade Organization, which is not a UN entity, and for a reason. The powers to be didn't want it to be fully integrated in the UN because it wanted to preserve a certain number of characteristics that are related to the way trade has been developed in the world. And I would say it has not been favoring Africa in its various deliberations. So an organization like the Economic Commission for Africa is really behind most of the efforts for regional integration, making sure that the negotiations on trade are favoring Africa. And so far, they are not. So this is a struggle. It's something that will require a lot of technical competence, but also a lot of political determination.
The other challenge that Africa faces to date is neocolonialism. You'll have people that will sit away somewhere in Nether or wherever and plan for Africa. And it's good when we have people that will realize that Africa has this challenge, let's see how we help them. But Africa seems to be extricated from this planning, and that means decisions are made wherever they are made, and then implementation is supposed to be done here. To what extent are we engaging Africa? Because we are trying to devise solutions for Africa, but are we involving Africa in this diagnosis and ultimately in being able to prescribe what medicine is good for Africa, what the remedies should?
By setting Agenda 2063, Africans have reversed this debate once for all. Because, they started with NEPAD, but now it's one step further, which is to take full ownership of the ambition of the continent, make sure that the continent is in charge of formulating its own strategies, and have a monitoring system that goes with it. What is missing really is much more performant statistical departments that will allow for Africa's narrative to be based on Africa's own analysis rather than depending on other people's diagnosis. Now, the time where, a minister of finance had to wait someone from Washington to tell what is the GDP growth of the country has to be over. And this is not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen with competence. It's going to happen with institutions that are strong. And I think Africans are really building that capacity right now more than ever before. And the discussion and the dialogue, the conversation about development has completely changed. There was a time where there was development economics, which was like economics for us, the Africans. And then there was international economics, which was the international system of mainstream economists. Right now, this discussion is completely overtaken by the events after the 2008-2009 crisis that collapsed all the various models that were being imposed as the mainstream view. And, there is a lot of freedom and policy space for people to formulate their own strategies. And I think Africans have taken advantage of it. They have proven resilience because they have grown more than any other region in the world, and they have good macroeconomic fundamentals. So they don't have much lessons to learn after the 2008-2009 crisis.
The United Nations Economic Forum for Africa, for which you are Executive Secretary, is an arm, a finger, if you like, of the UN. And many a time the UN has been blamed for not having the teeth to bite, not being able to follow through on certain things for many reasons. And so when we see the UN being behind such awesome initiatives, question would be, are these going to materialize? Because much of the time we see the UN, yes, good at planning, etc., etc. But then when it comes to enforcing some of these things, it depends on the willingness of governments to follow through on this. Much of the time the willingness is not there. So how do we see the UN go beyond just putting this together with the aid of these governments, but also following through, making sure that actually results can be attained, can be achieved?
Well, you know, Africa has lots of Pan-African institutions, but ours is one of the oldest. It was established in 1958, and it has actually hosted the first meetings of the OAU, and until 4 years ago, all the summits in Addis were taking place at the ECA. So there is a very strong partnership between the Economic Commission for Africa and all other institutions that have a Pan-African nature. In fact, you know, it was a resolution of ECA that created the African Development Bank. So you have to look into the ECA, yes, as part of the UN, but instead of saying it is a finger of the UN in Africa, I would reverse it and I will say it's a finger of Africa at the UN.
Interesting way to put it. Doctor, poverty is one of the biggest quandaries that Africa grapples with to date. There's many, there's famine, there's disease, there's a plethora of them. But poverty is one outstanding one. In the case of Uganda, for example, our GDP is still under 30 billion US dollars. Our GDP per capita is still under 1,000 US dollars. That is very disturbing. What would you say is the panacea? What need Africa do, or Uganda for that matter? Because we have sung this song for donkey's years. Countries at which we were the same level with back in the 60s, in the 50s, have leapfrogged. They are further away. We are still third world countries, and Uganda is still a third world country. How do we move away from this?
Because despite our growth in the last decade and a half, we have not transformed the structure of our economies. We continue to experience growth that is based on internal consumption and the exports of commodities. We are not going to make it if we don't structurally transform our economies. Structurally transforming our economies means three things, to put it very simply. Agriculture productivity is responsible for most of our poverty because the majority of the population, labor force, is in there, and you know their contribution to GDP has stagnated or has marginally increased, which means that the majority of the people are not having a bigger income, therefore they continue to be poor. The second problem is lack of industrialization. Every other region of the world has already industrialized. Ours is still lagging. We are latecomers in when industrialization is concerned. And this is extremely important because that's where you generate the massive jobs that go with urbanization and the youthness that we are experiencing in the continent right now. And finally, we have the problem of our services that is booming. It's one of the areas that is growing the most, but is not really formalized. The informal nature of our services is not contributing to the tax basket. And as a result, you know, the governments are squeezed. Our fiscal pressure is one of the lowest in the world, which means that the governments don't have enough resources to actually have more progressive and more energetic policies in every area, including the protection areas that concern poverty reduction. So if we don't do these three things, you know, increase agricultural productivity, industrialize, and formalize the service sector, we are not going to make it.
Analysts say that the 19th century belonged to Britain, the 20th century belongs to the US, the 21st century belongs to China. But there's people that feel it's possible for Africa to Gatecrash this and actually become the big name in the 21st century. Here in Africa, well, we are good at Gatecrashing parties, weddings, etc., etc. Do you see us Gatecrashing this? Do we have what it takes?
We have all the megatrends in favor of Africa. All other populations in the world are aging except Africa. So the demographic dividend is there for us to take advantage of. We have to do very focused policies to be able to tap into it. We have the natural resources. We have everything that it takes for us to be able to make it. And more than being gatecrashers in the 21st century, to be the leaders.
As an observer from the periphery, well, you actually are not on the periphery, you're in the middle of this. Your interaction with the leaders here in Africa, do you see the willingness to make some of these things happen, that we can begin to make steps to the betterment of our economies, especially here in Africa? Do you feel that? Do you sense it? Do you see it?
I see more and more African leaders that are reformists, that want really to reform and structurally change their economies. But I also like to point out that this is not about the leaders from the political standpoint alone. It's not about the presidents, it's not about the strongmen. Africa today is ready and mature to have leadership across. This is a much wider circle of influencers and a much wider circle of agents of change than what we're used to. Before, we depended on one person. Now, more and more, Africa is changing because the number of leaders is emerging in every possible sector, in every possible way, including amongst the youth. And I think that is the big change that we have to take into account.
Dr. Carlos Lopez, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Forum for Africa, thanks for talking to us.
Thank you.
Coming up is my opinion. Africa still struggles with many a challenge today. There is famine, there is disease, there is bad leadership, there is poverty, and maybe all these are tethered together in a way. But I think the biggest of these is our economic situation as Africa. We still grapple with low levels when it comes to the economy. We need to rise up and do something about it, and I believe it's going to take literally every one of us here in Africa. I know our leaders should take center stage, but look, as the population, maybe sometimes we need to awaken our leaders to get to the realization that things need to get better. Can they? That's a big story for this morning. Thanks a bunch for joining us. Morning at NTV continues in a bit.